It's really hard to think that she's going to walk back on all of that right now.
I just want to press the point. When a political candidate comes up with what I think is a good idea, I have to call it a good idea. And a $50,000 tax cut for small, not tax cut, but a tax credit for startups, for small businesses, coupled with less red tape. I got to say, that is a good idea, regardless of our other tax ideas.
While that may be a good idea, it's hard to see how she's going to move forward with it.
The chair of the RNC, which is now under full control of the Trump family, wasn't expecting Stuart Varney to sing the praises of any economic plan VP Harris presents. He's too busy trying to sell Trump's tariff plan that no one likes.
It's not a tax on the middle class, it's a tax on another country. If you look at McKinley, who was actually a great president, he made the country rich. It's probably the richest we ever were, relatively. But he taxed countries for coming in and taking our jobs, for bringing us their product, for taking away our factories because they would make it and come in. And he taxed them. It was called a tariff. And it's not a tax on people.
He taxed them. It was called a tariff. It sounds like Trump just recently learned the word tariff. And the name William McKinley as his inspiration. You know, the former president that implemented huge tariffs that caused a dramatic rise in consumer costs and dramatic political losses for the Republican Party. He even changed his mind on the policy that ended up sticking it to consumers while manufacturers bathed in their profiteering. He even gave a speech saying so just before he was assassinated. But why go back and reference the mistakes of 1901 when tons of people pointed out today?
We also do have nonpartisan groups like the Penn-Wharton group that put out their budget model and said that Donald Trump would take the deficit $5.8 trillion she'd only add $1.2 trillion. You had Goldman Sachs that came out today, and they said that the GDP will significantly decrease under Donald Trump and it'll continue to increase under Kamala Harris. Look at what Moody's has said, also nonpartisan, talking about how if you're going to round up a bunch of immigrants and you're going to have tariffs, which he keeps saying isn't a tax on consumers, and that's what the national tax is that people are talking about, if you're going to implement tariffs, guess what's going to happen? The economy is going to suffer for it.
But that's just Jessica Tarloff, you know, the Fox News contributor that reduces her fellow panelists on the five to crack jokes instead of salient points to refute hers. How about Trump's own economic advisor, Larry Kudlow? He must be saying something different.
Let's talk about who pays for the higher tariffs on Chinese imports. Here's what President Trump had to say this week.
Our country can take in $120 billion a year in tariffs, paid for mostly by China, by the way, not by us. A lot of people try and steer it in a different direction. It's really paid, ultimately it's paid for largely by China.
But Larry, that isn't true. It's not China that pays tariffs. It's the American importers, the American companies that pay what in effect is a tax increase and oftentimes passes it on to U.S. consumers.
Fair enough. In fact, both sides will pay. Both sides will pay in these things. And, of course, it depends.
If it's a tariff on goods coming into the country, the Chinese aren't paying.
No, but the Chinese will suffer GDP losses and so forth with respect to a diminishing export market and goods that they may need for their own
I understand that, but the president says China doesn't. China, it pays the tariffs. They may suffer consequences, but it's U.S. businesses and U.S. consumers who pay, correct?
Yes, to some extent. I don't disagree with that. Again, both sides will suffer on this.
He just couldn't fully admit that Trump's superiority-based idea to slap tariffs on foreign imports hurts the consumer. But they don't care about regular Americans. If you pay attention to what Trump wants to fund with these ideas, you can see just how little he cares about its effects.
Why don't we have a wealth fund? Other countries have wealth funds. We have nothing. We have nothing. We're going to have a sovereign wealth fund, or we can name it something different. I'll talk about it with Mr. Paulson, who's in the audience, and a lot of other friends of mine. And we'll name it something that's appropriate. Perhaps sovereign wealth fund wouldn't be appropriate, but it's going to be the same thing. We'll put tremendous amounts of money through all this money that will be taken in through tariffs and other intelligent things, and we'll have the greatest sovereign wealth fund of them all, and we should have, and that will be used to do things that will be great for our country, including to invest.
Leave it to the detail-deficient former president to pitch a sovereign wealth fund that'll be funded by his tariffs and other intelligent things that will be used to do things that will be great for our country. Just trust the guy that has bankrupted multiple companies and failed at nearly everything he does, except excite the most bigoted people among us, to take the money he plans to get and use it any way he sees fit.
If you win in November, can you commit to prioritizing legislation to make childcare affordable? And if so, what specific piece of legislation will you advance?
I think when you talk about the kind of numbers that I'm talking about, that because look, childcare is childcare. There's something, you have to have it. In this country, you have to have it. But when you talk about those numbers compared to the kind of numbers that I'm talking about by taxing foreign nations at levels that they're not used to, but they'll get used to it very quickly. And it's not going to stop them from doing business with us, but they'll have a very substantial tax when they send product into our country. Those numbers are so much bigger than any numbers that we're talking about, including childcare, that it's going to take care. We're going to have, I look forward to having no deficits within a fairly short period of time, coupled with the reductions that I told you about on waste and fraud and all of the other things that are going on in our country. Because I have to stay with childcare. I want to stay with childcare, but those numbers are small relative to the kind of economic numbers that I'm talking about, including growth, but growth also headed up by what the plan is that I just told you about. We're going to be taking in trillions of dollars, and as much as childcare is talked about as being expensive, it's relatively speaking not very expensive compared to the kind of numbers we'll be taking in.
Donald Trump just pitched using the trillions of dollars he expects to somehow receive through tariffs for childcare costs. Does that mean he'll take some of that money in his personal sovereign wealth fund and distribute it among Americans that have young children in need of some childcare? Or is he just taking any expense he's never thought about addressing and claiming that his tariffs will pay for them without giving it a second thought as to how? Because J.D. Vance already revealed just how much they've mulled over addressing childcare costs with this answer.
What can we do about lowering the cost of daycare? Hayden, obviously a working family, and it's very hard for working families to get by. How will we lower the cost of daycare?
It's such an important question, Charlie. And I think one of the things that we can do is make it easier for family models to choose, or for families to choose whatever model they want, right? So one of the ways that you might be able to relieve a little bit of pressure on people who are paying so much for daycare is make it so that maybe like grandma or grandpa wants to help out a little bit more, or maybe there's an aunt or uncle that wants to help out a little bit more. If that happens, you relieve some of the pressure on all the resources that we're spending in daycare. Now, you talk about just daycare. Let's say you don't have somebody who can provide that extra set of hands. What we've got to do is actually empower people to get trained in the skills that they need for the 21st century. We've got a lot of people who love kids, who would love to take care of kids, but they can't, either because they don't have access to the education that they need, or maybe more importantly, because the state government says you're not allowed to take care of children unless you have some ridiculous certification that has nothing to do with taking care of kids. So empower people to get the skills they need. Don't force every early child care specialist to go and get a 6-year college degree where they've got a whole lot of debt and Americans are much poorer because they're paying out the wazoo for daycare. Empower working families, empower people who want to do these things for a living, and that's what we got to do.
It's pretty obvious that the plan from the Republican ticket for the White House to ask grandma to raise your kids because she doesn't have a life of her own won't work out for most people the way it did for Vance. Just because his mother-in-law was able and willing to leave her profession to live with JD and Usha so that they could continue to make their millions doesn't mean everyone else has that luxury. And how does lowering the educational requirements for child care professionals help with the costs of daycare? Their goal is to hoard more of your money, and they'll pay lip service to your financial issues like the cost of living and childcare in order to do it. Because people that pay attention to these plans, they're not on board.
For the last 4 months, we've been pointing out that there are no Fortune 500 CEOs who are supporting former President Trump. And that is a historic break going back to William Howard Taft and through Calvin Coolidge and Ronald Reagan and the Bushes and everything, is that it's been anywhere from 40 to 60% public and financial support. It's zero now, and it was zero in 2016. And the Trump economic package frightens them. It's extremely inflationary. The tariffs, 10% across the board on all imports, that's just crazy. It leads to a 3% increase for sure in inflation and plunging the GDP. Right. And that's before retaliatory gestures. The increase in the deficit, he wants to cut $5 trillion of taxes with no commensurate cut in expenditures. So these are problems.
These are problems that didn't seem to translate well to the audience at the Economic Club of New York, where Trump reeled off aspects of his plan to folks that could be described as anything but excited.
And the Arab nations, and we're very honored to have some of my friends here with us today from that part of the world, but they're working very hard, despite being here, that I not be your president. They don't like me. Meanwhile, Kamala Harris can't bring down the price of anything because her energy policies are driving up the cost of everything. Everything is up, way up. We will eliminate a minimum of 10 old regulations for every one new regulation. We'll be able to do that quite easily, actually. And instead of attacking industries of the future, we will embrace them, including making America the world capital for crypto and Bitcoin.